We live in a world where the possibilities of science are incredible. However, it can either be used for good or bad. For example, let's take radioactive materials. They can be used to diagnose or to treat cancer, but they can also be used to wipe a nation out as a devastating weapon. It's the same with, for example, fire. It can either warm your house or it can burn it down. Joining me now is Matt Gardner, who is a clinical scientist, or a healthcare scientist, I guess we'll go for. And I want to delve straight in and ask the question, do you think that science and faith can work together?
Yes, absolutely. For me, as a scientist and a Christian, I feel that part of my job is to help those things to work together because I use science in a healthcare environment. So I try and use science to improve health, to make people better, to be part of the process of healing for some people when they find themselves in hospital. And I think this is what Jesus calls us to do when we have to love our neighbours, when we have to act out of love for others, is we have to act in a way that contributes to building people up, to improving health specifically for me, using science, but we can do it in other ways. We can do it with communications, allowing people to stay in touch with each other across the world, or when people become housebound and this kind of thing. So yeah, I think in really important ways, there's a lot of important questions that science and faith ask us, or that can bring up. But I think with a bit of thought, we can help resolve a lot of the problems. So yeah, for me, I don't see a conflict at all. I think the problems of science and faith are very overstated.
So you mentioned problems there. Let's take that a little bit further. And how do we resolve these problems? Because there will be scientists listening to this who aren't Christian and they think, well, actually, no, I've done my research on this and I don't think that I need a God. Or potentially they feel that science has these answers. How do we resolve these problems and these concerns?
Yes, and yeah, you're absolutely right. I can honestly say I've been there because I was a scientist before I was a Christian, and for many years, for me, my feeling was that I'm a scientist. I don't need faith. The science was a massive barrier to faith for me because I felt that science was about figuring out things for yourself, um, being self-sufficient, moving in a way that I can reason and figure out and make sense of the world. And I felt that faith was about blindly accepting things, just being told this is the way it is. Um, there's nothing for you to work out here. And it was only when I started looking into it more carefully, when I became a Christian, that I realized that actually there is this really beautiful compatibility. So I think for scientists, and as a scientist who wasn't a Christian, there was a big problem for me because I just thought science is the barrier to my faith. I can't look at faith. I won't even reason it. And I understand that for Christians, because now I see that side as well, that we can look at the findings of science and the models it creates, and we can start to view them maybe as a threat to our beliefs. So science might become something fearful, something we can't trust. Obviously, for me, science and faith are both really important. Science is my profession. I believe it's a massive part of my calling about what I'm supposed to do with my life, to contribute. And as a Christian, obviously, my faith is critical to me. It's a massive part of who I am. It's how I try and live now. Um, so I think to start to resolve these problems is I think science explains a lot of things and it has a lot of power in that way. It can tell us how things work. It can tell us things like how our hearts function physically, um, and why things happen a particular way. And then we can even, we can harness that power to do things. But then I think what we do with those things, whether we use radiation, as you mentioned, to produce weapons or to produce cancer therapies, that's not necessarily a scientific question because we can do both of those things. That's when our ethics and our morals and our philosophies and our faith become really important. And so for me, I think faith is about why things are and what we should do, like why we exist. The science studies creation, the laws of nature as we find them. It doesn't necessarily comment on their origins or why there is a universe at all or why it is the way it is. So I think that questions that deep down a lot of us care most deeply about are things about meaning, about origins, about purpose. And our faith is really important to answer those questions. And importantly, it can provide us with guidance to grow in wisdom, which I think is incredibly important. And we can start to think about how do we use the finding of science appropriately and responsibly, out of Christian love and out of good stewardship for what we're given by God. So I think there's different things going on there, and there's different questions which are both important. So to take it back to, I'm aware of a friend of mine's daughter asked this question a while ago, which is, why do rainbows exist? And they gave the answer, refraction. But they said this in Sunday school, and the Sunday school teacher apparently said, no, rainbows exist because they are the reminder of God's promise, as written down in the Bible. But I think that those two things are both true. That yes, rainbows exist because of water in the air and light from the sun passing through them and refracting, producing this really beautiful optical effect in the sky. Scientifically, we can understand the process behind how that's happening right now. But I don't think that makes the purpose of that happening any more untrue. I think that those two things are both important. Those two things don't contradict each other. So for me, both of those questions are important. Is how is that happening? And why is that happening? So when I started thinking in this way, I started reading my Bible a lot more, and I found it so enriching to my scientific mind. So for me, when I was a science student at university, I have to admit, I was one of these who got really annoyed that I got funding to do a physics degree through the Students' Loan Company and all of that process. And I felt that my degree was really, really useful and should be funded. And I used to get annoyed when people did like degrees in arts and English literature who were also funded, because I was like, oh, what's the point in these things? And it was only when I became a Christian, actually, that I started to get very interested in things like history, when I started reading the histories of the Bible. And now I'm fascinated by things like Anglo-Saxon history and all this kind of thing. I got fascinated in much later periods of history that aren't biblically mentioned. And I started to wish I'd studied more English literature in school when I started reading my Bible, because I felt now I'm studying a work of literature as well, and works of history. And I knew that there's ways to analyze and understand these things too that I've always rejected. So now I'm much more interested in literature, and I read fiction and things, which I never did before as a scientist, because I just thought it was a waste of time. So these topics that I overlooked when I was a physics student because I thought they were unscientific are now actually so important. And I've moved on from that person who was annoyed because people do English literature degrees. Now I'm really happy that people do, and I wish I'd studied more of it when I had the chance. So I try and do what I can now. So I think for me, my faith opens up much more questions and things to study and understand. So so my faith enriched my science so much. When I realised that there are these different questions and different ways to approach, and it's important that we do that these different topics are so important, and being a Christian made me realise that.
And I guess sometimes as Christians we can be a bit scared, can't we, of science, in case there's something we haven't discovered. And I used to feel like this a few years ago, that I was thinking, have I missed something? Is there some evidence that science has got that I haven't found? And if I did see it, I wouldn't be a Christian any longer because it would prove this Bible thing wrong and it would prove things
Mm,
about Jesus that were wrong. So
mm.
just tell us, how can Christians engage positively with science? Because we shouldn't be scared of it, should we?
No, absolutely not. And you mentioned things about disproving the Bible. So early on in my Christian life, I one of the big challenges to or one of the big things that I had to resolve in my faith was the historical accounts of Jesus. And so I'm not a historian, but I studied as much history as I could, and the historical evidence that Jesus existed and was who he said he was, and that what he said was recorded accurately, is so incredibly strong, and that was so important to me as a Christian. Um, but again, I wasn't in that sense thinking scientifically. I was thinking in terms of history. That there's other ways to learn about things and study beyond science. Um, Whereas I think science was my all at one point. I thought, it's the only way to get knowledge. Whereas actually, history and philosophy are really important things that help us to convince ourselves, if we need that convincing, if these things are a barrier to us, that what we're reading is true. So, in terms of how can Christians engage with science, I think to start with, I think it can be really helpful to talk to some scientists. And I think when you start to do that, you see that there are a lot more scientists out there who have a faith than you would expect. So when I first started as a Christian, I think for a time I thought, am I the only scientist here? Um, and it is fair to say, in my local church, yeah, there aren't many scientists, but I think that there are many, many more scientists out there than you would think that hold a faith. And so, when I start having these conversations in my workplace where we are a scientific department, there are Christians there that I didn't realize they were Christians until I started talking about this kind of thing. So maybe that is a message that we need to be more open about my faith. So I think talking to some scientists who hold a faith is really helpful. So Devinda, my wife, and I, we run the faith experiments. So we felt convicted because of this to run some sessions in churches where we explore questions of science and faith. And we look at it through our lens of healthcare science. So we try and bring those kind of questions to it. So we run this program, which we've managed to get some funding for. So we can go out to churches and we can talk to people about our faith, our role as scientists, and we try and do this in a really fun, family-friendly way. So we are very happy to be contacted and do that. But I think there's also lots of organisations out there. So there's things like the Christians in Science Network, who have experts in lots of different fields, scientific experts who are also Christians. So they can bring people who we talked about artificial intelligence in the last episode, who are much more expert in that field than I am, for instance. So there's a lot of different organizations out there, and these organizations can help with resources. They've kind of got leaflets, books, things that help with this, and visits. So I've got permission to plug the Cake Network. So if you go to believingscience.org/cake, there is cake, that's the dessert. So that's believingscience.org/cake. There's a list of all these different organizations that support a really positive interaction between science and faith, and agree that science doesn't have to be a barrier to our faith. And there are organizations that focus on schools, there are organizations that focus on working with churches. So I think that's a really good way to get started, is by checking out these places where there are scientists who have a faith. And it's a good way to get started with education in this topic about what science is and what it has to say. And I think we should be doing this because realistically, we're all affected by science in the church. You know, if we have sound systems in our churches, there's science going on. If we use mobile phones, there's a lot of science going on. If we did virtual services during the pandemic, so I think that we don't have to fear that as Christians, but we can be thankful to God for that, for the advances that science has given in our lives that allow us to communicate, that allow us to have better healthcare. And I think that that would be a really good start too. And then yeah, you're right. There are scientific questions that can be challenging to faith, and I've had to deal with this as a young Christian, as a non-Christian, and then as a Christian who is a scientist. Um, but I think we need to engage in those questions, because if we're going to talk to people in the world about faith, then we need to be educated in these questions, and we need to understand how people resolve them. And I think there's a lot more people and a lot more resources out there than you might realize, because I was very surprised as a young Christian, just what is out there in terms of helping answer these questions.
Matt, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.